Hello, I'm really happy to be here with all the Headwaters participants. I'm Lynn Sickey, professor of anthropology here at Western State, and it's my very great privilege to be introducing Devin Pena, this evening's keynote speaker. And I'd like to also thank Brooke Moran for asking me to do so. Dr. Devin Pena is a professor of anthropology and ethnic studies at the University of Washington, Seattle. At his home institution, he's also affiliated with the Women's Studies program and Environmental Studies programs. His 1983 PhD is from the University of Texas. He's also the founder of the Acequia Institute, which I'm sure that we'll hear more about from him, a nonprofit organization that supports education into agricultural resilience. It promotes social justice, and it fosters collaborative research. The Acequia Institute also provides fellowships for graduate students, and just recently awarded 3 of these. Dr. Pena divides his time between teaching in Seattle and a combination of living, farming, and teaching in San Luis, Colorado. In both places, he pursues his research and writing. In San Luis, he also devotes a great deal of time to his fields, his animals, and his crops. He relishes, I know, being part of the San Luis community, and he has, in fact, become an integral part of the community of farmers and residents in San Luis from their perspective. And if that doesn't keep him busy enough, he continues to write and publish really tirelessly. His book, entitled Mexican Americans in the Environment, Tierra y Vida, was published in 2005. His 1998 book, The Terror of the Machine, Technology, Work, Gender, and Ecology on the US-Mexico Border, which is about the transnational factories there called maquiladoras, won 2 prestigious book awards. He's also written a 3rd book, edited 2 other books, one as a senior editor of 4 volumes of the Oxford Encyclopedia, and written numerous articles and book chapters. So his credentials really speak for themselves, but I would like to add just a short bit to this and talk about his important role in educating Western State students. Since I first met Devin right here at the 2007 Headwaters Conference when I was new on campus, and I broached the idea of having some Western State students visit San Luis, he has been unfailingly enthusiastic, welcoming, helpful to me and to our Western State students. More than 30 anthropology students have now visited San Luis, and over the past weekend, another dozen environmental studies students, where we've had incredible opportunities to have hands-on experiences there. And through it all, we've been welcomed very warmly by Devin. So we've talked to him, we've learned from him, we've camped on his land, we've been fed his delicious meals, he's a great cook, we've been serenaded by his guitar and charango. So I want to thank him publicly for this true friendship and guidance that he's provided for us. Our speaker has much to contribute to this year's Headwaters topic of redefining prosperity. From his research and community contributions in agroecology, environmental justice, the restoration of the commons, and place-based ecological knowledge. Tonight, he's going to tell us about how the 3 E's meet the 3 R's, from ecology, economy, and equity to resilience, resurgence, and revolution. It's with great pleasure that we welcome Dr. Devin Pena.
I'm starting a new style where, I wear my Peruvian Andean cap below my hat because I'm bald, and if I take that off, I'm cold. I want to thank everyone, Laura for the great retrospective. I miss George, wish he was here. I miss Ed Quillen, our Good Times. Ed's here. There he is. And I'm hearing a terrible echo, so let me back that off a bit. And I really do want to thank Brooke for the incredible work you've done organizing this. John, for bringing your students and passing some good times with us. I look forward to decades of collaboration between the Acequia Institute and this beautiful little college here in Gunnison. Before I get started, I also want to thank my wife, if she would get up for a moment, Elaine. She really put up with I was a bear the last 2 days as I prepared this keynote. And the title of my keynote is, of course, The 3 E's Meet the 3 R's, from ecology, economy, and equity to resilience, resurgence, and revolution. A Family Dollar store is quickly going up on Main Street in San Luis, across from her post office, and just a few feet from the official boundary of the National Historic District. The grand opening is slated for sometime in late October or early November. Among those of us who live in, or those of you who have visited our community, this is a pretty big deal. Family Dollar will be our first Alco. It'll be our first chain store to open its doors in the entire 157-year history of our town. We have had locally owned franchises. In fact, Joe Gallegos' grandfather, 5 generations removed, Dario Gallegos, opened one of the first McCormick wagon and John Deere dealerships in Colorado starting way back in the 1890s. But this is different. Dario's wagons and John Deere tractors and cultivators did not result in the abandonment of our acequias or the decline of our local place-based heritage cuisine. With the Family Dollar store, San Luis may have taken the first step toward membership in the ubiquitous and homogeneous landscape known as the generalized elsewhere, perhaps to go along with a newly emerging placeless amnesia. Some folks see the arrival of the Family Dollar as a sign of prosperity. Finally, the people of San Luis have enough cash and food stamps in their pockets so they can buy the cheap, mass-produced plastic gadgets and widgets imported from China, India, or Vietnam, and to partake in the consumption of overly processed foods from other sources of late capitalist maldevelopment. Local consumers will finally be directly linked to the global commodity chains of neoliberal late modernity. There is even an ecological upside, we've been told. Locals now won't have to take a gas-guzzling 90-mile round trip to Walmart in Alamosa to purchase $1 2-pound bags of high-fructose corn syrup masquerading as candy or BHT-leavened cereals. They can stay local for their supersized bottles of Coke, Pepsi, or the daily specials of BGH milk and CAFO eggs and Frankfurters. Prosperity has finally come to San Luis in the form of $1.99 specials, new and larger always, of 1-gallon plastic bottles of Hawaiian Punch. I want you to hold on to that image for a second. Take a swig out of your bottled water. I hope it's not a Fiji. Allow me to contrast this with this disturbing image of crass commercialization, out-of-control ecological footprints as signs of prosperity, with the following images of our local, slow, and deep food known as chicos del horno. The people of the southwestern Headwaters have produced this artisanal, handcrafted heirloom food at least since the time of the ancestral pueblos, the so-called Anasazi, which is at least 5,000 years past. This food is that deeply grounded in place. It is also a slow food because the process of producing our adobe oven-roasted heirloom corn, or chicos, involves 3 months of field labor, followed by several weeks of activity around the actual oven roasting and the processing for winter stores. Altogether, this entails 15 distinct steps to produce the roasted and dried corn used in winter elk stews and other seasonal heritage cuisines. Now, each step involves really intense cooperative labor and the artisan knowledge of dozens of people. This year, more than 30 people, including all the students that visit us from this wonderful little college, participated in our production cycle. 3 of us farmers, Joe Gallegos, myself, and Adelmo Caber, our 80-year-old mentor, collaborated on the production of the corn. We grew about 1.5 acres on my land. Joe Gallegos disked, planed, and furrowed the field. Adelmo planted and cultivated it once. I cultivated it a second time and irrigated the crop. So just the growing of the corn involved 3 farmers and dozens of helpers. Not 1 penny of money was exchanged throughout this whole process. The production of chicos is an ancient practice. In adobe, the Indo-Hispano farmers developed chicos roasting by adopting the Pueblo Indian practice of cooking in adobe ovens. The primary reason for this is that there's a very short growing season at 8,000 feet, as you all know, and a very long winter. So the roasted corn is the perfect food for the winter stores, and it retains its freshness for years. This was a good idea, of course, before electricity and refrigeration, when all you had were your root cellars, your souterranos. Chicos, then, are for me the epitome of food sovereignty. It is deeply rooted, locally produced, and appropriate for a heritage cuisine in tune with the environmental conditions of our livelihoods. Producing chicos is a very elaborate process, as many of the students sitting here today learned. It's very labor intensive. And there are 16 major steps involved. We've been seeing some of the photographs of that in producing this heirloom white roasted corn. You have to prepare the field. I've already described that. You have to disk, you have to level, you have to furrow, you have to set up the cabecera, which is the staging area for flood irrigation. You have to do the planting, the irrigating twice, sometimes 3 times. You have to cultivate at least twice. You have to harvest several times. You have to then get into the process after harvest of actually preparing the corn, which is the photos you were just seeing. You have to strip half of the cob, half of the corn husk to promote very thorough cooking and also to discourage scorching. Then you have to soak the corn in water, build a fire, which is an art form, because how do you know when it's hot enough? That's a very important point. And it's really quite a mystery still to me. You have to steam the crop overnight in the sealed horno. You have to remove the steamed corn from the horno, strip the remaining husks from the steamed corn, then removing the roasted corn from the oven and laying it out on drying racks for about 3 to 5 days. We're still not done. Then you got to strip the kernels from the cobs, a process that we call desgranando. And then you clean the chicos on a windy day, and then you finally can package them or put them away for future use. Now this year we repeated this entire process, starting with step 5, the harvest, 7 times, to produce a not so staggering quantity of 600 pounds of stripped and dried chicos. And that's part of what makes this artisan handcrafted food so precious, is that there's never a lot of it around. We also do not harvest all the corn, and a fair portion ends up left out on the stalks to dry for use as seed for the next season. So cultivating, harvesting, and roasting chicos is the epitome of slow, local, and deep food. The entire process takes 9 to 10 weeks. And it's also worth noting, I suppose, that our maíz de concho is a landrace heirloom variety that's been seed safe by families for 7 to 10 generations in our case. This maíz de concho, our local heirloom, is a 70 to 75 day variety that was adapted over many generations to our high altitude condition. Our acequia farms are at an average elevation just under 8,000 feet above sea level. Because our heirloom corn is such a rapidly maturing variety that has been kept in the same families for so long, we do worry about companies like Monsanto I know they're interested in this sort of short season variety because of climate change, and so we protect our corn very carefully. One of the studies done by a maize geneticist, a colleague of mine, Ralph Bertrand at Colorado College, found that the multi-generational maíz de concho that we use from the Corpus A. gallegos family contains, this is outrageous, genome sequences found also on Anasazi copse at Chaco Canyon and other abandoned Pueblo sites. So again, this is what I would call local, slow, and deep food, deep, millennia deep, of seed saving passing from Anasazi to Pueblo to Chicano people. Now, you could say that both of these scenes that I've presented, the Family Dollar and the Chico's production, both of those scenes are about corn people. You have the high fructose corn syrup people, who we might call Michael Pollan people, in deference to his notion in the Omnivore's Dilemma that the U.S. has replaced the Maya people as true consumers of corn, except we hardly ever eat corn itself. So we have the high fructose corn syrup people who might shop at Family Dollar, and then we have the Chicos del Horno people, who we might call the deep food folks, who produce their own heirloom corn, kissed with adobe smoked goodness. But while Pollan's people might shop at Family Dollar for gallon-sized jugs of soda pop and juice sweetened with HFCS, the sweetness of deep folks' Chico's corn is adobe roasted, caramelized goodness and is the product of the efforts of many people, family and friends across the generations. Also, by the way, nutritionally, Chicos are a high-fiber food, very rich in phytonutrients and amino acids that combine nicely with the protein in elk and other favorite wild and domesticated meat sources that are part of the traditional Chico stew recipe. Now, this corn story is not just an anecdote. In the anthropology of comparative foodways, it brings to mind a larger picture. And then brings me to the statement serving as the epigram for this keynote address, and often used to express a very central principle of the environmental justice movement. Quote, "We don't want an equal piece of the same carcinogenic pie," close quotes. So my question to you all is, how do we define prosperity in light of this statement? What does equity mean in this context? I wish to examine the concept of prosperity by discussing how we might reimagine the link between ecology, economy, and equity, or the 3 E's of the triple bottom line that Laura just mentioned, and is our conference theme this year. My approach to this, and it is already illustrated by the Family Dollar high fructose corn syrup people and Chicos del Horno deep folks, involves 3 R's, counterposed to the 3 E's, or integrated into the 3 E's, to account for local, place-based cultures and communities. I will therefore begin by first making an appeal to the ecology of resilience, the first R, instead of sustainability. I will then discuss the need for a shift from rational and acquisitive individual actor models of economic relations to the resurgence, the second R, of mutual reliance, cooperative labor, and similar reciprocal models of economic exchange. And then I will shift to a discussion of the need for a revolution, the third R, in knowledge-power relations that subverts notions of equity through the self-organizing, and I would call them reiterative, forms of place-based autonomy. So we have, therefore, resilience, resurgence, revolution to accompany ecology, economy, and equity. And then I will close by examining these rather theoretical proposals in light of 2 very important recent legal and legislative developments in the state of Colorado. The legal one is the 2002 Colorado Supreme Court decision in the case of Lobato versus Taylor, previously known as Rael versus Taylor, an important case that restored traditional common use rights to La Sierra de la Culebra, otherwise known formally as the Taylor Ranch, and more recently as the Cielo Vista Ranch. And the second important event, recent legislation, in this case is the 2009 Acequia recognition law that was signed by Governor Ritter back in April. My goal, of course, is by using these two cases, these two examples, is to illustrate for you the concepts of resilience in ecology, resurgence in economics, and revolution in equity. So let's first think about how we might reimagine ecology in a shift from sustainability to resilience. Sustainability is dead. Long live resilience. Since 1972 and the first Stockholm Conference to address human impacts on the environment, environmental scientists, activists, and policymakers have been fretting over how to prevent or mitigate the continued and apparently accelerating degradation of our planetary life support systems, the infrastructure that Vandana talks about in Soil Not Oil. The result of this 3-decade-long search for a solution to human-induced destruction of the conditions that sustain life continues today. Obviously, most of you are familiar with the debates that continue this issue: climate change, continued deforestation, soil erosion, worsening air and water pollution, the destruction of ocean ecosystems, and the use of genetically engineered organisms that are released into the environment without even a pretense at having a predictive ecology for their effects. The list of human-induced threats to life on our planet is very long. The advances in biotechnology, nanotechnology, human genomics, plant genomics, and other emerging fields of scientific research, and their ill-advised commercial applications add new threats to this list every day. It's really hard to keep up with that list because of the lack of oversight and regulation, the lack of transparency, proprietary secrets by corporations, all imposed by decades of neoliberal policies that have allowed the privatization and deregulation of everything, from the waging of war, including most recently acts of rape that are protected basically by contractual clauses in Halliburton's efforts to control dissent within its Iraqi war contractor population, to the patenting of the genes in your body. I am, of course, referring to the patents on the BRCA1 and 2, so-called breast cancer genes, which are now owned by a company in Cambridge, Mass. Known as Myriad Genetics. There are currently more than 6,000 patents on the human genome. One involves, by the way, something that I call frankenrice. It is a rice human transgenic plant. They basically splice human genome and rice genome together so that the rice becomes a biofactory, a biological factory to produce human proteins that presumably will be used commercially in energy drinks, watch what you drink, and diarrhea treatments. By the way, that was not approved by the FDA for testing in the United States, so they went and tested it on Andean native children, many of whom got sick as a result of these trials. These problems persist because the sustainability discourse, which we've addressed over the course of 20 years of Headwaters gatherings, it always comes up, and it's presumably ecologically oriented policies and strategies. This discourse has always avoided making a clear identification of the actual source of our problems. The sustainable development advocates have always insisted that this is about too many people, and another more insidious variant of that, too many poor people who are usually dark-skinned folks in former colonies. Or it might be that we're not making enough investment in wilderness preservation. You might recall my debate with Roderick Nash here, I think at Headwaters 3, about that. Industrialism and mass consumption is also blamed in all societies communist, socialist, or capitalist, lack of education on evolution, biodiversity, and the importance of the conditions that sustain both, or maybe the problem is there's just too much urbanism, too many cities, too much reliance on fossil fuels, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the culprits in the sustainability discourse. Now, the problems I have with this are not that population, poverty, lack of wilderness, overconsumption, fossil fuels are unrelated aspects affecting threats posed to ecosystems by human beings. The problems I have with the conventional take on the search for meaningful sustainability are that, one, it usually fails to name capitalism. Thank God for, what's his name? Moore's new film? Capitalism, a Love Story? Go see it. Yeah, thank God for that film. Second, it fails to distinguish between the poverty of deprivation and the poverty of a subsistence lifestyle or right livelihood. And third, it generalizes westernized concepts of development, sustainability, and progress. And then finally, it devalues and misrecognizes place-based ecological knowledge as either primitive superstition or a continuing source of underutilization and mismanagement of valued ecosystems. Let me address each of these in turn so I can get to the principal idea of resilience that I am proposing as an alternative to mainstream equilibrium ecologies of sustainability, failing to name capitalism. Now, some of you were here when I debated Roderick Nash. Ed, you were here, you remember that. One of the points he made to critique my presentation as we debated the concept of wilderness was that I had forgotten the principal problem underlying environmental degradation. This was overpopulation, and echoing Paul Shepard, he added, the rise of herding and domestication of animals, especially cattle. That didn't go over too well with the Western State College crowd. This was an odd statement for the distinguished professor to make. After the debate, he immediately turned to George Sibley and asked for his honorarium check while still on stage. He was flashing out of the Headwaters gathering to go on a yacht cruise. How ironic, no? One of the most prominent environmental philosophers was literally flying out to have lunch the next day on his boat. That's why he didn't get invited back, I guess. Through this rude behavior, he proved my point. I had argued in my rejoinder that he had forgotten that the main source of the problem, which I defined as capitalism, which is, after all, the premier agent of history that has commodified life at all scales, from the entire biosphere, as in cap and trade agreements, to the molecular level, as in the patenting of human genes. Now, some of you may be thinking, as Nash alleged, well, what about China, the Soviet Union, and the Eastern Bloc countries of Europe? They damaged the environment just as much as the good old USA, Western Europe, or Japan, didn't they? Well, yes, and they are doing so even worse to this day, producing much worse ecological outcomes, actually, compared to certainly many parts of the US or Western Europe. But these were not communist or socialist countries, at least not in the sense that the old Moor, Karl Marx, understood these social formations. I rejoined the debate by arguing that Lenin had studied Frederick Winslow Taylor, the founder of time and motion study and so-called scientific management of labor, to apply the industrial capitalist model of labor process organization to the Russian factories. Lenin destroyed the actual roots of would-be communism when he banned the workers' councils, or Soviets, from any role in the management and organization of the factories. Tens of thousands died protesting Lenin's decision. After Lenin and later Stalin purged the factories of any Democrats, there were no Soviets, and therefore no workplace democracy in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. For Marx, workplace democracy is a critical aspect of communism, as is the decommodification of labor. Communism for Marx is more than anything else the abolition of labor, the end of work, as a necessity imposed on your social being and survival by others seeking to profit from your body's creative and muscular capacities. Taylor's model of absolute managerial control over workers became known as the American system, or Taylorism, and it was applied by Lenin in setting the stage for what became known among the Frankfurt School, and especially Herbert Marcuse, as state capitalism. Just because prices on commodities, including labor as a commodity, are set by a centralized, ruthless, and authoritarian planning regime does not mean this is not capitalism. All we have to do is look at the current healthcare debate and the behavior of the insurance companies to realize that, right? They're brutal, violent entities. State capitalism in the former Soviet Union remained committed to the capitalist scheme of reducing people to wage labor, denying their creativity, treating them as interchangeable commodities whose most important function is the ability to produce other commodities at a rate of compensation that is always less valued than it ought to be to sustain a life. We're all familiar with this system because it is the same one we live under. The Soviet Union became what it was by studying us. We should know that. Except for the planning part, which tends, in our case, to be more chaotic and decentralized and under the power of another phantasm, the invisible hand of the neoliberal market. Therefore, we need to name capitalism as the principal agent and source of the ecological crisis. In China, in Mexico, in Brazil, in Thailand, in the United States, in Russia, everywhere in the world. It's the only system we've had for about the last 200 years or so. This also means we need to critically re-examine the challenge of the concept of sustainable development, because the co-optation of this idea has transformed an originally subversive notion into one that roughly translates as economic sustainability in the face of adverse changing ecological conditions. The corporate appropriation of sustainable development discourses has turned us into a nation of recycling green, but nonetheless hyper-consumers. Rethinking poverty is my second objection. Now, most advocates of sustainable development and global environmental protection have assumed for decades that the principal cause of ecological degradation is the overpopulation of poor people. For original communities in a place, development too often means displacement, not development. Displacement from millennial ancestral homelands and forcible urbanization into what Mike Davis has recently called a planet of slums. This leads me to the third objection against the sustainability framework. Whose development? Vandana has also shown us that the concept of development is itself problematic. She asks that we consider the question, development according to whose model of economic organization and social values? The implication is obvious, and it implies a critique of what Shiva calls epistemological violence, which is the idea that Western capitalist nations have shown little to no tolerance for social and cultural diversity, especially when it comes to other ways of knowing and being in economic terms. But there is a related problem, and this has to do with my effort to propose the bioregional concept of inhabitation as a counterpoint to the capitalist concept of development. I prefer the term inhabitation to development because, and I think John was implying this when he talked about infrastructure, because ecosystems are already richly developed. They don't need to be developed. That development is there if we use the indicators of diversity of species, diversity, integrity of habitats, the integrity of energy circuits and landscapes, and the complex and ever-shifting interrelations among all of these. So in turning toward an ethics of inhabitation, I reject the notion that development has anything to do with the well-being of the planet and all its life forms. Indeed, much of the destruction of biological and cultural diversity is a direct consequence of capitalist-imposed development. I am proposing, therefore, that an ethic of inhabitation is the ultimate anti-capitalist and anti-globalization paradigm shift we can envision and desperately need to engage in a movement for just sustainabilities. This also requires we recognize inhabitation involves above all, resilience. After all, to survive the shock and awe effects of catastrophe or disaster capitalism, as Naomi Klein calls our present system, cultures and ecosystems must have the ability to bounce back from grave ecological, social, and political disturbances. You have heard me make this argument here before. As biological diversity is crucial to the resilience of ecosystems, so too cultural diversity is essential to the health of human social systems, and especially in the endurance of robust local place-based communities. Today, the proponents of resilience theory or resilience thinking represent a critical break with the conventional environmental science and activism associated with the old school of ecosystem ecology, who remain committed to a search for a dynamic equilibrium, or what Eugene Odum called homeostasis, which was seen as a necessary condition to render an ecosystem as healthy, to consider it healthy, but in the context of an unquestioned dominance or continued dominance of actually existing capitalism. Today, scientists recognize that chaos, disturbance, and complex non-equilibrium landscape dynamics are more the norm in ecosystems than order and stability, such that diversity is often driven by natural disturbances and disaster rather than some climate succession resulting in stable systems. Of course, we all know that asteroid encounters with the planet are the penultimate example of a natural disturbance that completely rewrote the story of life on the planet. But it produced the diversity of life on the planet, including the rise of the mammals, and of course humans, who would not have evolved to prominence without these uncertain, unpredictable, catastrophic events. We can see this current economic, climate, social justice meltdown as an opportunity to use disturbance to reinvent the rationality underlying our economic and political systems, a point I will return to shortly. Finally, part of my critique of the failure of sustainability advocates to name capitalism as the primary culprit requires that I turn briefly to the problem of the devaluation of other people's cultures, including their knowledge, their epistemologies of place, and their commitment to patterns of resilient inhabitation instead of development of their homes. Everywhere I look in the sustainable development literature, I see an incredibly arrogant approach that assumes that Western experts in environmental science and development planning alike, who are primarily white, male, and middle class, are the only humans around with the knowledge needed to plot a new direction to enforce upon the planet's hordes of inhabitants a means to protect their own life support systems. Hell, poor people don't even know how to spell the word ecosystem or biogeochemistry, much less act to prevent ecological degradation. That's what I read in the discourse. The privileging of Western science and technology, wet as it is to neoliberal economics, is a sure recipe for world conflict and strife and a continuation of a world in which the have-nots try harder to become like the have-a-lots. Can we truly argue that prosperity comes only to those who follow the Western global capitalist model of development? We are already seeing how China's combination of political authoritarianism, totalitarianism, and free market capitalism results in nothing less than a critical violation of people's rights and of the Earth's thresholds for resilience in light of increased carbon footprints clearly implicated in global climate change. And China will soon exceed the US as the biggest carbon emitter. The planet cannot afford the hyper-consuming nation of the United States, let alone the addition of a new Chinese imitation model of mass production and mass consumption. I will note that China's economic miracle is really more like the Mexican model that was championed by the dictator Porfirio Diaz between 1870 and 1910. He too believed in vaccinating Mexico against foreign occupation by pretending to be like the foreigner and adopting the economic system of the United States. Therefore, as the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, become more westernized, more American, and neoliberal in their political economic formations, the colonialist destruction of traditional environmental knowledge spreads from the Americas to the rest of the world. We will do well to remember that Americans invented the destruction of place-based ecological wisdom and then replaced it with largely ineffectual environmental impact statements, which today treat pollution and deforestation as events that can be reduced to cost-benefit analysis and traded as development damage permits. I turn now to the problem of economics, now that I've talked about ecology. The second E. This is the most challenging part of my talk tonight because it requires that you have at least some rudimentary understanding or knowledge of what is known as rational choice theory and game theory, more broadly construed. Sadly, outside of Tier 1 research university economics departments, this is not familiar terrain to most of us, including college students, graduates, and faculty. Let me start by revisiting an earlier premise. Capitalism in all its forms, including the Soviet centralized state form, destroys the natural conditions of existence, so it cannot provide a rational basis for magical policy solutions to social, environmental, and political problems. It's not the economy, stupid, it's the economics, stupid. Social and environmental problems are effects and consequences of capitalist control of the global economy. And this leads to what O'Connor calls the second contradiction of capitalism. And that is that it's based on the idea of eternal expansion on a finite world and therefore begins to distort the very conditions for its existence. The political problems are a function of the structure of power knowledge imposed by the hegemonic power of corporations and their neoliberal hacks in the governments. With more nuance, the problem is a dominant behavioral economics that reduces all life to the science of cost-benefit analysis and presumes that this allows us all to pursue maximum satisfaction, freedom, through the search for a perfect knowledge of prices. This is an objective science of economics that seeks to maximize the benefits that accrue to individual rational actors, whose only rationality can be this self-serving interest and fulfillment of egotistic desire. This is a fairly horrid model for the nature of the human being, and we must begin by acknowledging and declaring our rejection of this as a fundamentally erroneous ontological principle. Are humans really just greedy money grubbers? Is self-interest the only form of enlightened interest in modern economic terms? Did Hayek deserve the Nobel Prize for thinking through these assumptions about the constitution of power and freedom in the form of the inviolate, rational individual actor seeking maximum knowledge of prices to plan a better world for optimum self-conservation and self-satisfaction? What about all those cultures and civilizations without words for individual, commodity, or price? In fact, 80%, maybe higher, of the world's language, I'm told, don't have the word individual, have no word for commodity or price. Are we to ignore these alternative rationalities? Are we to presume Western superiority because we have words for individual property or commodity? Are we superior because we have a rational cost-benefit science of prices? A lot of good that does the displaced native, the homeless family, or the wartime refugee. Why are these three concepts, individual, property, commodity, so intertwined in our legal philosophy and practical law, in our domestic and foreign policies? Why are they enshrined like commandments? By the way, note that the Arizona legislature is contemplating an act that would ban the teaching of any ideas or theories in secondary and post-secondary, any ideas or theories that are critical of Western civilization or capitalism. Every year we see more like the Soviet Union. I don't think the U.S. can go it alone any more than I believe we can trust elected officials, corporate CEOs, and their obedient troops of experts to resolve social, environmental, and political problems. They would promote more of the same, top-down power, managerialist approach to planning a brave new world of global neoliberalism. I don't think the U.S. can be allowed to continue using the metric of a selfish national security interest, read, keeping a safe business climate abroad for Halliburton, as the benchmark for defining our place in the world. No nation state, including China or India, should have this sort of status. States and corporations, in other words, are not to be trusted with matters of planning a transition to a more just, sustainable, and resilient economy. Civil society, which is to say, all the forms of human association that are beyond the reach or command of the market or the state must be the soil we root this process in. A localized participatory democracy is, in my estimation, the only form of organization that even gives us a long shot at creating a more just, sustainable, and resilient society. Our anti-economics must be grounded in the local struggles for autonomy, for the place-based homeland common. By now, many of you in the audience probably are thinking, oh my God, the good professor is some sort of radical anarchist. I actually will beg to differ. But to do so, I must first shift to responding to the elemental question. What are the alternative rationalities to the idea of the selfish individual proposed by rational choice theory as the only entity worth of freedom, capable of freedom for that matter? Now, John Maynard Keynes, the founder of the theoretical force behind FDR's New Deal, once said, quote, "Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist," end quote. I agree. This is a great quote from Keynes. And this is why I believe that any critical discussion of prosperity must address the quandary, because it's taught here too, I'm sure, of neoclassical and neoliberal economics. Just, sustainable, and resilient future communities may have to be based on what I'm going to call the anti-economics of the Commonwealth. I propose this concept of anti-economics to suggest, extrapolating from Keynes, that all economic theory is defunct. Marx, by the way, argued this point precisely in the Grundrisse, and the primary point he was making there is that capitalism is not so much an economic system. Marx actually didn't believe in economics. It wasn't even a mode of production. Instead, he saw it as a social relationship of power. That's how you should define and understand capitalism. The future theory of the economics of the Commonwealth will likely emerge when we find the appropriate expressions derived from our bioregional and place-based experiences. I cannot, like, say, Jeff Sachs, predict or project what policies should be adapted. Instead, I focus on the need for a new process of problem solving together, one that shifts the terrain of action to local place-based communities. And so I want to skip over to that. Next slide, please. I turn next to the lessons we might learn about these matters of how we redefine prosperity, sustainability, development, progress, freedom, and equity in light of the critique of equity based on the recent events that we have experienced in one of our Headwaters communities, and I am, of course, referring to the San Luis Valley, and especially the Sangre de Cristo land grant and its highly resilient Hispano-Acequia communities. As everyone here very likely knows, in 2002, the Colorado Supreme Court ruled in the case, the land rights case of Lovato versus Taylor, and they shocked the world, including our own community, by restoring the historic rights to the commons of the 80,000-acre Sangre de Cristo land grant to the heirs and successors of the original inhabitants. What most people may not have heard is that Ken Salazar, Obama's Secretary of the Interior and a native son of the San Luis Valley, recently visited us in San Luis on August 28th. The official purpose of his visit was to participate in the dedication of the new Sangre de Cristo National Heritage Area. But while he was in San Luis, Secretary Salazar made a bombshell announcement. The federal government intends to purchase all the rather large, privately held high mountain estates that have long defined legal ownership of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in south central Colorado and northern New Mexico. The lands in question, close to 1 million acres, are currently owned by wealthy elites. These include what was once the Malcolm Forbes Trinchera Ranch, which is now owned by Louis Bacon, a hedge fund manager and the publisher of the New Yorker magazine, which consists of close to 180,000 acres. The Cielo Vista Ranch, formerly the Taylor Ranch, but known by the local people simply as La Sierra. This is now owned by Bobby and Dottie Hill. And then, of course, the other big chunk would be Ted Turner's Vermejo Park Ranch, which is approximately 588,000 acres, or about 920 square miles. These landscapes include two 14,000-foot high peaks, two 14ers, Cisnagini, otherwise known as Mount Blanca, and the Culebra Peak above our home, and more than a dozen peaks exceeding 13,000 feet in elevation. The central section of the Sangres is also absolutely critical, by the way, to the future of biodiversity conservation, because it links the northern part of the southern Rocky Mountain biome with the southern part. It's like a skyline bridge linking the northern and southern part of the southern Rockies. How we as a society got into the business of allowing the rich and powerful to own entire mountain ranges is a question we ought to ask ourselves every day. At more than 1 million acres, this purchase, which would probably involve a transaction of close to $1 billion, would constitute one of the largest acquisitions of the public domain in the Southwest in more than 100 years. And you are looking at a photograph from our farm along the Acequia del Medio, looking toward the heart of our commons. This is the land that would be federalized. However, as many of you all know, there are much older and more deeply rooted claims to these mountain lands. All of these lands include the skyline mountain watersheds that are also the historic commons of the original settlers of the Sangre de Cristo and Maxwell Mexican period land grants. Now, some will claim, well, Mexicans and now Chicanos have no more right to these lands than Anglos because these originally belonged to Native Americans. I can state unequivocally, in part because the International Indian Treaty Council has supported this view, that Chicanas and Chicanos are Native Americans. And indeed, this is true if you consider the fact that the first Mexican origin people that farmed New Mexico were Tarascan and Tlaxcalteco native peoples, not Spaniards. There were very few Spaniards in the entradas. Intermarriage between these Tarascan and Tlaxcalteco people with the original Pueblo and Plains people forged a native identity and place-based character in the emergence of the Chicanos. It is significant also that the Ute Nation endorsed the land rights struggle of the people of the Culebra River land grant communities to restore their common lands. Now, La Sierra, obviously, or Mountain Tract, was the subject of that 2002 Colorado Supreme Court decision that partially restored our use rights, but without subsistence hunting and fishing, and involving about 500 families of heraderos, or heirs and successors, with a stake in those rights to the Sangre de Cristo land grant commons. Over the past 20 years or so, I have been interviewing dozens of participants in the original lawsuit and its successor, Lobato v. Taylor. These interviews are part of a long-term and in-depth ethnographic and historical study I'm preparing for a book that's coming out next year called The Last Commons: Endangered Landscapes and Disappeared People in the Politics of Place. Now, La Sierra, or the Mountain Tract, the middle section of the million-acre Sangre de Cristo land grant, which was issued in 1844 and permanently settled in 1851, was actually the last of the Spanish and Mexican-era land grants to be issued and settled. This is why I like to joke that when people brag about, oh, San Luis, the oldest town in Colorado, I say, yeah, the last town in old Mexico. La Sierra, then, is the last land grant commons to be enclosed, to be privatized or converted to the public domain in 1960. Much later, much later, decades later, in some cases a century after some of the land grants in New Mexico had suffered their partitioning and enclosure by the end of the 19th century. It is also the first land grant commons to be restored as a community resource for the local farmers as a result of the previously mentioned Supreme Court decision in 2002. This was an unprecedented legal decision that restored common use rights to land that is still under private ownership. This has never happened before and could have a very profound impact on all the pending claims involving more than 120 such common lands in New Mexico alone. Now, every family involved in the land rights case sacrificed a lot over the 30 years of litigation. Some even had Zachary Taylor place liens on their historic Acequia farms to guarantee payment of attorney and legal fees before the 2002 ruling reversed the lower court. They risked everything, including the possibility of losing their ancestral farms to get their day in court and find justice. Now, obviously, these families are concerned that their lifelong sacrifices and cherished traditional resource rights will once again be trampled under the proposed federalization of La Sierra Commons. Some of these families fear that even if the Obama administration and Secretary Salazar make a deal that includes respect for and security of these historic use rights, the political reality is, when and in the event that Republican conservatives retake the presidency and Congress, those rights will likely be challenged and undermined. It has happened before, and some local people pledge to engage in direct resistance, including land occupations, to prevent a public domain enclosure that fails to secure and respect the historic use rights in perpetuity. Others fear that the conversion of La Sierra to the public domain will close off the dream shared by the majority of the heirs to directly purchase the lands through a community land trust. Now, this too has a precedent in the form of the Rio Costilla Cooperative Livestock Association that gained ownership of a significant chunk, about 32,000 acres of the southern part of the land grant in New Mexico. In Colorado, I helped begin such an effort in 1992 with the creation of La Sierra Foundation of San Luis. We were sadly interrupted in our efforts to raise money to buy the mountain as a community land trust. That was interrupted by Governor Romer when he signed an executive order creating the Sangre de Cristo Land Grant Commission in 1993, which resulted in a 5-year effort, which was unsuccessful, to secure a local community state partnership purchase of the land from Zachary Taylor Jr. He rejected that offer and sold it to Lou Pai of Enron Energy Services. When the Enron scandal broke apart and Enron went bankrupt, Lou Pai had to sell the land, and that's when he sold it to the current owners, the Hills. Now, a lot of people in San Luis say, look, this land was stolen from us, and it should be returned to the rightful heirs, the acequia farming communities, because we rely on that mountain as our watershed. It's the most important infrastructure service provided by the mountain. The gradual melting of the snowpack provides our spring and summer irrigation water. We fought Taylor over the logging, by the way, because we knew that if you remove the overstory canopy, you accelerate the rate at which snowpack turns to in-stream flow. And since we don't have storage rights on our acequias, we are now having problems irrigating deep into the season on many of the drainages. We also point to the experience of Mexicanos and Chicanos in New Mexico with the public lands. They point to the bitter and tragic experience of the acequia land grant communities in the Vallecitos sustained yield unit in the Kit Carson National Forest across the way from Taos on the other side of the river. They saw their old-growth ponderosa forest destroyed by outside corporations from Albuquerque and elsewhere. During the 1950s and 60s, it was the Chicanos who were fighting the logging. Nobody was there to help them. Then all of a sudden, the Johnny-come-lately environmentalists showed up, of groups like Forest Guardians, and they tried to shut down the traditional small logging operation that the Chicanos had finally gotten after decades of struggle. We should not forget this. When Reyes Lopez Tijerina staged the Tierra Amarilla courthouse raid to make a citizen's arrest of the district attorney, he did so because Chicana and Chicano civil rights have seldom been respected by La Floresta, the U.S. Forest Service, which has seldom acted in good faith to follow the law or its own regulations to invest in stabilizing traditional, rural, cash-poor, and resource-dependent communities that may actually often be the best stewards of the land. Next. As I sat in the Denver International Airport this past February 19th, waiting for a flight back to Seattle, a day after testifying before the Colorado State Legislature, next, in support of House Bill 123309 on acequia recognition, I found myself sitting there at DIA reflecting on the day's proceedings And I could not help but recall an excellent book by a friend of ours, I know Laura knows him, Professor Charles Wilkinson, who wrote a beautiful book, Crossing the Next Meridian, Land, Water, and the Future of the West. I think we discussed that book in 1992 here at Headwaters. The opening chapter, I was sitting there in the airport thinking, what's that first chapter called? And then I realized it's called The Lords of Yesterday. The Lords of Yesterday. Who are the Lords of Yesterday? He outlines and criticizes 3 laws that have come to shape pretty much close to everything about the settling of the lands west of the 100th meridian, an area Wilkinson calls the Intermountain West. You can go to the next one. The 3, stop there, that'll be great. The 3 Lords of Yesterday, Wilkinson explains, were the Euro-American settler miners, rancher farmers, and loggers that relied on the federal government in 3 laws to settle, exploit, and transform the West into what was essentially an extractive resource colony that displaced native cultures, laws, and ways of life. The General Mining Act of 1872, the Homestead Act of 1862, and the doctrine of prior appropriation, with roots in California, 1849, and later the Colorado gold rushes. These were the 3 most significant legal frameworks imposed on native peoples in the conquest and enclosure of the West and the despoliation of its native commonwealths. The water law of the Intermountain West has been defined by the prior appropriation doctrine ever since the hard rock miners in California and Colorado declared themselves to be first in use and first in right. Never mind that Native American and Chicana communities had their own laws for the allocation and use of land, water, and other resources. In recent decades, researchers have deemed these alternative systems to be more democratic, resilient, and ecologically sustainable compared to the modern regime of water law. The Acequia legal code is rooted in the deepest antiquity, and it clearly predates the advent of the prior appropriation regime. And it is so deep, actually it's as deep as the Kuls of Kangra, India. It went from India through Afghanistan to Iran and into the Middle East and North Africa, eventually going to Spain and then coming here. That's quite a circuitous route from India to the San Luis Valley. That's the evolution. That's how deep Acequia institutions are. Yet in 1882, the Colorado Supreme Court, in a very famous and, to me, creepily named case, Coffin versus Left Hand Ditch, that the only true water law of Colorado was prior appropriation, the principle of first in use, first in right. Now, this tragically mistaken, ethnocentric decision erased hundreds of years of legal evolution in the water allocation and use practices in upland headwaters territories that had been sovereign parts of local place-based cultures under native Spanish and subsequent Mexican rule. The Colorado Supremes, however, enshrined prior in Left Hand Ditch, despite the fact that the Colorado Territorial Legislature had just enacted 3 laws recognizing acequias and acequia governance norms during the 1870s, just a few years before statehood and the Left Hand Ditch case. While acequia principles are as true to place, in fact I would argue perhaps more so than prior, Left Hand Ditch nonetheless imposed prior as the only water law held to be true to place in the state of Colorado. This had the effect of erasing the institutional memory and the earliest forms of water governance and local democracy in the region. Despite this legal erasure, the acequia water democracy and its forms of local self-governance persisted over time through wholly informal arrangements, deriving ultimately from the commitment of the people to their own mutual reliance instead of individually acquisitive interests. Those mutual reliance interests are the heart and soul of acequia norms. The new law will restore some crucial aspects of the legal paradigm of acequia customary law and practice and make Colorado a more progressive, legally plural state in the area of water law. Will the General Assembly see fit to allow us to punch this hole, albeit small hole, in the edifice of one of the principal laws of the Lords of yesterday? Well, as I was writing this, the House of Representatives voted unanimously on the third reading to approve this law. And then the governor signed it in April. I'd like to thank Senator Gail Schwartz, who played a key role as the co-sponsor of this legislation, along with Representative Ed Hill, who's the first acequia farmer in the state legislature in close to 100 years. Now, the bill is very significant because it recognizes that acequias have, quote, this is the law, historically treated water as a community resource rather than a commodity, and allocated water based on equity in addition to priority, end quote. Moreover, the law also states that, quote, the acequia has historically been operated pursuant to a one landowner, one vote system. In other words, one farmer, one vote. That's our watershed democracy. In one very short but pithy paragraph, the law legitimizes 5 central norms of acequia water law that are very distinct from the principles enshrined in the doctrine of prior appropriation. And these are: water is a communal resource and not a commodity. 2, the principle of one farmer, one vote. This restores our cherished democratic practice that was lost with the shift to prior system of share-based voting, in which large landowners have more votes. 3, the law also specifies that acequias may rely on labor supplied by the landowners of irrigated land served by the acequia, a phrase that restores our customary practice of cooperative labor and mutual aid. 4th, the law establishes that water is a community resource for purposes of acequia governance. Therefore, incorporated ditches will be able to adopt bylaws or modify existing bylaws to exercise what is called a right of first refusal on the sale or transfer of water to non-acequia uses. Incorporated ditches may also use conservation easements to restrict water transfers or sales. 5th and finally, the law allows acequias to allocate water on the basis of principles of equity and fairness and not just priority. This is an especially important principle since it allows irrigators to share scarcity in times of drought instead of following the priority call system imposed by prior that provides water only to the most senior water rights at the expense of more junior rights. We have restored the potential to act on our principle of shared scarcity. That sharing of scarcity is part of how we define our prosperity. Now, some questions are emerging. Are we really on the cusp of a minor revolution in how we define equity? This law represents a revolution in the concept of equity and in the evolution of water law in the West. Are prior days a singular normative regime for water governance numbered? Are prior days as the dominant regime of water law numbered? Will a plural regime emerge in Colorado watersheds with historic uninterrupted acequia water use and customary allocation practices embraced by these place-based principles? Now, the law was not entirely in keeping with what Representative Vigil, Joe Gallegos, and I had in mind. The original draft we worked on included language that would allow acequias to form acequia conservancy districts or to convert existing conservancy districts into acequia conservancy districts. Now, this is important because it would establish or really re-establish acequias as bona fide sub-county level form of government, as governmental authorities. This would also mean that the acequia conservancy districts would be authorized to serve as referral agencies in the evaluation of land use regulations and development impacts. We also had stronger language allowing acequias to declare that since shares in the acequia ditch corporation are shares in the company and not the actual water, and since the water is regarded as a community and not a private property asset, then there is no takings implied by acequia norms that prohibit the sale or transfer of water as an asset in place. So the acequia recognition law, despite these limitations that we will continue to seek to address, does represent a revolution in the way Colorado government describes property rights, environmental values, and the significance of preserving a local, place-based culture. It is, in this sense, a step in the right direction. Before I get to my concluding remarks, allow me to comment a bit here about the photo that you're looking at, because this is part of what the acequia recognition law has embraced. That's a picture with Elaine in the front, my sister Tanya, some parciantes from the San Luis People's Ditch in San Luis. This is our annual limpieza y saca de acequia, our annual spring ditch cleanup, which we have every April, and it brings together the community, next, not only to clean up the ditch, but we share this wonderful meal. This year there were more than 60 farmers and helpers on hand. And of course the meal is usually a 2-hour affair in the middle of the day where we eat all local foods from last year's harvest, like chicos and bolitas and so on. And it's a wonderful event that builds up the social and relationship capital that is the basis of our prosperity. This was what John was hinting at. And when you witness, next, this sort of collaboration involving not just the acequia farmers, their friends and family, Western State students or Colorado College students occasionally drop by. And in fact, this year we have even had a tourist who just saw us working in the ditch, pulled over and joined us. He understood the importance of social capital. There are no fast food outlets in San Luis. No Taco Bell, no taco smell. We call it taco hell. No McDonald's, no Burger King, Fatso Burger or Sonic Drive-In. We have 2 local Mexican food restaurants. They're not very good. And a barbecue express that was just recently opened a couple of weeks ago by a refugee couple from New Orleans, an African-American gentleman and his Chinese-American partner. We do have 2 grocery stores. John mentioned one of them. Felix Romero's, Steve's dad's store, R&R Groceries, is considered to in fact be the oldest mercantile and dry goods store in Colorado. They often stock some of our local produce, like the Chicos del Horno and Bolita beans, but they're not allowed to sell beef, as you were pointing out, from the local ranchers. The other store is located in our Cuva neighborhood. We have a Cuva in San Luis, and it's called Sonia's. And the owner, who hails from Mexico, stocks a great diversity of imported Mexican canned, bottled, and bakery goods, along with a rather typical convenience market inventory. But every now and then she has amazing local pork chops, which is probably illegal, and seasonal offerings of homemade tamales, roasted green chiles, and pozole. There are 3 gas stations in town, and all offer some sort of locally produced treat. For example, Central Oil on Main Street offers great potato, egg, chorizo jalapeño, breakfast burritos, and homemade flour tortillas. Now you might be wondering, gee, there's not a lot of places to get food. Where do you go shop? Well, the Family Dollar will become the first presence of global capitalism on our main street. Some locals predict that the Family Dollar will fail, while others fear it is a harbinger of the beginning of the end. I think we can easily survive the influx of those who would try to convert the Chicos corn people into the high fructose corn syrup people. The Culebra acequia farming villages are already off the map, self-reliant. Oh, that was the Western State College tent city at Rancho Dos Acequias. We are already off the map, self-reliant, earth democracy communities of the type envisioned by Vandana. We already have a robust, resilient, and socially just local food system, although clearly too many of our youth are opting out for a deranged diet of supersized fast foods. We already have a source of renewable energy in our gravity-driven acequias and our new county biodiesel plant in Mesita that we, the local farmers, can use to grow and process our own fuel and thus get off the energy grid that is unraveling in a post-peak oil world. We already have our deeply rooted local institutions of self-governance, the Acequia and La Merced, the Land Grant Users Association. These are the natural and social forms of capital that form the basis of our prosperity. Only we don't view these natural and social assets as capital, that very force that drives the process of commodification and degradation. Our natural and social assets were built around a multi-generational attachment to place, nurtured by the Acequia families over the centuries, and that is the source of our resilience and prosperity. And it is important to understand that sometimes the Earth's infrastructure, its biodiversity, is actually produced by humans. We can act like beavers, disturbing the environment, transforming it, but in the process creating habitat for more diverse forms of wildlife. And indeed, I think that is one of the hallmarks of Acequia agriculture, is that we are landscapes of really messy diversity, where the edge of the field and habitat for southwestern willow flycatcher or yellow-throated warblers are right next to each other, happily coexisting. Well, finally, for those of you who are wondering, how does this help us? How can we apply this to our situation? There is no one model in ecology that fits, that is the solution to all problems. At the most, I can only suggest that you find an analog in your community for our acequias. Maybe it's a CSA project, a community-supported ag project. If you find an analog for the Acequia Institute or the Acequia Institution and combine that with a struggle to restore and recover the commons, you have to remember, for me, the acequia is the water web tether that binds me to my local community. Through everyday lived experiences of mutual aid, cooperative labor, shared knowledge, and conviviality. Your analog might be a community-supported agriculture project, CSA, with a strong commitment to social justice. So, that way it is not just white middle-class folks and students, but in Gunnison, you might bring the Cora community to participate in building these alternative pathways to ecological democracy and resilience. This is the true revolution of a place-based humanity that experiences a resurgence of the oldest forms of human collaboration and cooperation in the form of the homeland commons, as we reject individualist consumerism for sustained co-inhabitation by people that understand their true roots are in the mutual reliance relationships that sustain us and the planet in complex, ever-shifting mosaics of life. Thank you. So, questions? Yeah.
Our society is not too
Yes.
keen on criticizing itself.
I think, in a way, the current healthcare debate, healthcare reform debate, has already done that to an extent. If you listen to Rachel Maddow or Ed Schultz or Keith Olbermann or Read the Nation, progressive media, they're already doing that, and they're not getting firebombed as terrorists. So I think we don't have, first thing to do is don't be afraid to be labeled. We know you're not. I'm not a terrorist, but I hate capitalism. Now, does that mean I hate markets? No, I just happen to believe that capitalism is not the only take on how to organize a market. It's not. Vandana Shiva talks about this all the time. You know, people talk about free markets. When markets are free of corporate domination, that's a free market for me, and that's what I support. And so if you always combine your sense of indignation with an understanding of what is capitalism? Do we really even know what that is? Is it the free enterprise system, laissez-faire? It's none of those things. Those are all mythology. So the first thing I think one has to do is deconstruct and understand the history of that economic that social relation of power. I almost call it an economic system. It's really a relationship of power that forces you to work without compensating you for the full value of your work, and also by making every effort to automate your job or export it outsource it somewhere else. Why? You're costing too much. Since when does a human life cost too much? Now, I think there ought to be a limit on income. If no one can live on $1 million a year, they're nuts. Now, imagine guys that get $200 million signing bonuses or bonuses, not because the company actually made any money, but because the stock price was inflated by speculative dynamics. 200 million for that? We know what happened with AIG, with Goldman Sachs. All of this recent meltdown brought all this to the public's attention, and that's why Moore's film, Capitalism, A Love Story, is really well timed, because it's going to keep this idea of, we can critique capitalism and not be accused of being terrorists or subversive or communist. And what's wrong with communism? Do we even know what it is? It reminds me of that statement by Gandhi, Western civilization. It's a great idea, too bad it's never happened. The same thing, I think, with communism. We've never had communism anywhere except in indigenous societies. And in fact, when I think about acequias and our collaboration, look, Corny cuts my hay, Joe rakes it, I bale it. Joe cuts his hay, I rake it, and Corny bales it. We're engaged in this constant exchange of labor and knowledge and equipment. I could not farm without my neighbors in the acequiahood, as I like to call it, rather than neighborhood, in the acequiahood. It's the neighbors of the acequiahood that sustain my ability to be a productive farmer. And the same is true for them. I have a new tractor, we call it the Blue Demon. It's a New Holland, TD 5050, with a front loader, and I've got a round baler. And I do that, I take my tractor and I'll fix a road for someone, I'll move some bales for someone else, I'll do some disking, I've become a really good round baler. I love round baling. It's just, for me, very zen to be there in the tractor watching the computer read out so that you don't get pregnant or lopsided bales. And I've gotten really good at it. And everybody wants me to bale their hay now. And I'm more than eager to do so because everyone does so much for me. They're my mentors and my neighbors and my labor helpers, and I am theirs. And so that is communism for me. And by that I mean communitary, socially oriented cooperation. What is so wrong with that? I think your great-great-great-great-grandparents did that for everybody, and we've lost that somehow. And we've become a nation that it's all about the individual. You can't count on anyone. Maybe a little charity here and there, but if you're poor, it's your own damn fault, period, end of story. We're not going to look at structural issues. We're not going to look at discrimination or racism or classism or machismo or sexism. None of those are relevant anymore under the neoliberal formula of how, the only way you're judged is what kind of a market actor are you? What kind of a rational actor in the free market are you? And that's the only thing that you're going to be judged by. We've lost, therefore, a sense of the social, cultural, intellectual capital, if you want to call it that, that makes for community, for creating a sense of place, and for transmitting these values from one generation to the next. So I think it's really very important to keep these things in mind. But the first thing to do is educate yourself. What is capitalism? You should read Karl Marx, but not the Communist Manifesto or the German ideology, which is what they make you read in college. Read the Grundrisse. All 1,000 pages of it. Maybe all 3 volumes of Das Kapital. Amazing stuff in their history of the bloody expropriation of the peasantry, the enclosure of the commons in England. All of these things are in there, and most people have no clue. They're afraid of Marx, they're afraid of communism, but they have no clue what those two are, nor do they really have a very clear idea what capitalism is, because of how it's taught in our schools as what? Free markets, laissez-faire, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Those are the ideologies that construct a very distorted, misshapen view that we have of capitalism. But don't be scared. Let them call you a commie. I call myself a communist all the time just to push people's buttons, to get them to think about what is that? And interestingly, your generation, unlike Laura's and mine, they're no longer spooked by that. They don't have the Soviet Union, right? They don't have that Cold War. Now it's, the Taliban and Osama bin Laden and all of that. And so the commies are no longer so scary. And in a way, that's a good opportunity for us to re-examine what kind of an economic system do we want? Do we want a system in which one person can make $5 billion a year while 5 million people make $10,000 a year? That can only lead to crime, delinquency, conflict, murder, rape, poverty, hunger, malnutrition, environmental degradation. It's not going to work. It's not working. We don't need to even test that idea anymore. We know it's not working. So what is the alternative? Start in your own place, in your own neighborhood, your own community. Build social relationships with neighbors, with other students, with your families, your extended networks. Build those social relationships of cooperation, mutual aid, and mutual reliance, and you'd be surprised how far you can go. Every community-supported agriculture project that I visited around the country all over was based on that fundamental first step of people deciding, let's cooperate instead of compete. And just that mere act of shifting from individualistic competition to social cooperation, mutual aid, will result in the revolution that I'm talking about. Nonviolent, no firearms involved, totally nonviolent, peaceful transition that's there and happening because we're doing it on the ground every day as a lived experience rather than some theoretical debate or waiting for the state to give us permission to be free. That's what I mean by autonomy. Autonomy means we create our own freedoms here and now by organizing ourselves as members of connected communities. And the reason that I want to recommend a book as a way to end my answer to your question is there's a wonderful book by Michael Taylor, who used to be a rational choice theorist, one of the best. He was almost as smart as John Nash, Nash equilibrium. And he shifted out of rational choice theory, and he wrote a book that answers why in the title. The title of his book is Rationality and the Ideology of Disconnection. And that's why he gave up on rational choice theory. Because in rational choice theory, the dominant paradigm for all economics in this society, in the world, is based on the fundamentally flawed idea that we're individuals, disconnected from others, in some sort of Hobbesian nightmare, automatons bouncing into each other. We need to create the Leviathan to protect us because we're greedy and selfish and only interested in self-conservation. And he rejected that theory and proposed that the reason he did was it's an ideology, not a science. It's an ideology of disconnection. And we're not disconnected. We're all connected to each other, to other living organisms, to ecosystems, to the whole biosphere, as we are beginning to realize as a result of the climate crisis. I probably should have done that the whole time instead of reading this stupid keynote. Yes. Hey, Rob.
Thanks for talking with us, man. I'm interested in your talk about making social change within our communities, and very interested in your idea that you floated out there to us that we might consider in the future incorporating communities such as the Cora community here in Gunnison into our own community-supported agriculture. And I see parallels with that idea to what I saw up there on the screen when I saw a group of Western State College students in your community helping you guys out. And so I'm interested in your experience convincing your community to bring in what might be considered outsiders, which is, a similar cultural migration, I feel like, as the Cora from Mexico coming up to America for labor. We're going to see as global oil declines, a squeezing off of the white middle class from the capitalist machine and searching out communities such as yours to find a home in. What experiences with your community have you seen, and what can we learn from that process?
Thanks for that question, Rob. I've been there a long time, almost 30 years now, and that community itself has changed a lot. And some of the change has to do with not being so insular, not so suspicious of outsiders. It would have been very difficult to bring classes like this, like the ones that have been visiting, in the 60s. Forget it. It would have been impossible. The Tierra Maria courthouse raid had just happened. There was all sorts of violence. That was also about the time that, especially in the Taos area, hippies were coming in as Back to the Earth movement, and their homes were being burnt down in San Luis. And that's why we developed a reputation as being lawless and violent. That was an undeserved reputation, but it served a very good purpose, actually. It kept us off the development map. And in a way, we still try to cultivate that reputation. Yeah, we're lawless and violent because we're hoping that we'll stay. We don't want to be developed. We want to inhabit our place like we have for generations. That's what we're interested in. The question you've asked leads me to another place. Far away from here, to Los Angeles, to the inner city, to South Central Los Angeles, where for about 6 years I collaborated with a group of Mesoamerican indigenous people in the largest urban farm in the United States, 10 acres. Have any of you all seen the Oscar-nominated film, The Garden? Anyone? You got to check this film out. It's nominated for an Oscar, didn't get it. It's called The Garden, and it's a history of the South Central farm, located on 10 acres in the middle of warehouses, railroads, highways, and a very high crime, poverty area. Right in the middle of that is this green oasis that was farmed by Mesoamerican people from Zapotecs out of Oaxaca, Seri from Chihuahua and from Baja, to Maya people. There were 15 different indigenous populations working at that farm. And they collaborated in creating this beautiful oasis with white people, black people, African, Asian, American people. It was a true rainbow of diversity to match the diversity of the crops that they were growing on those 10 acres. My experience is that if we don't learn how to do that, we're going to be in an awful lot of trouble, because the United States, as you all know, by the year 2040 or so, will be a majority of minorities. And the white people will be a minority, numerically speaking anyway, not necessarily in terms of power. But unless we learn to be inclusive and to nurture each other's differences, there used to be a sticker in Colorado Springs, of all places, that used to say, tolerate difference. I don't want to be tolerated. I want to be celebrated. There's a huge difference. I mean, think of the power position to be able to say, oh, I'm going to tolerate your homosexuality, right? So I'm going to let you get almost to marriage, but not quite. You can have domestic. That's tolerance, and I don't want any part of it. Neither should you, anyone. I want celebration. I want you to embrace my whole being. I don't want you to tolerate me. That means there's something wrong with me, right? You're tolerating it like a pest or a nuisance. That's just the wrong-headed kind of thinking. So sometimes we get tolerance and we think, oh, we've made great progress and we're collaborating. That's not true. That's a myth. It's just taking the prejudice and the discrimination and hate to a new language, a new level of deception. That's all that is. And so if you want to build multiracial, multicultural, multi-epistemological communities, you're going to have to reach out across difference, not because you're tolerant, but because you're so hungry for it. And the fact of the matter, we were just talking about this the other day in San Luis, after you all left, and we were talking about, we were sad because you left. And we were sad also because you all worked so hard, and yet we're having trouble recruiting youth to our own Sembrando Semillas project, which is to mentor our youth in acequia agriculture for the next generation. Who's going to be the next generation of acequia farmers? Our youth are leaving. They're not interested. They don't want to learn this stuff. We were really sad by your absence because it reminded us of two things. One, your dedication and hard work, and how our own community is failing at transmitting that dedication to acequia farming that you all have coming in from the outside. So in a way, you're more of an insider than some of our young generation. And that's tragic. But it's also a source of inspiration for us that if you all care about us, then we ought to care about us too. And therefore we should work as hard as we can and redouble our efforts to make sure that the next generation of our local kids is dedicated to this way of life as well. One of the things that I've been doing research, in fact, one of my grad students and I have a couple of chapters coming out on what's called the food justice movement. And one of the things that we've noticed is that a lot of the alternative food systems that are being created serve the privileged. You know, the people who can already afford to buy organic, rather than the people who are marginalized and food insecure. When you reach out to the Cora, and this is what happened at South Central Farm in Los Angeles, you don't do it as charity or welfare. You ask for their knowledge. We need your help, guys. And the Cora, like the Zapotecs, are great farmers. They have probably more agroecological knowledge in one person than everyone in this room put together. So they could help you be better farmers in your CSA project. And that's how you approach them. You don't say, oh, we're worried about you all, do you have enough food? And they're going to get pissed off and just write you off. So it's all about dignity and respect and recognizing people's knowledge and skill. And Mesoamerican indigenous people are among the foremost agroecologists on the planet. And they can really help a lot in helping you manage a CSA project, for example. But that's the way I would approach it. That's what worked in Los Angeles as well. People didn't want handouts. They wanted to take care of themselves, but they lacked land and water. Once the community organized to get that land and water, they could provide for themselves and become autonomous producers of their own food justice. And I think that's the way you work with the Cora in this community. And it'll enrich you, and it'll make them happy, members of a collaborative community that you're trying to build. That's the kind of social, cultural capital that John was talking about earlier at the start of our